Chapter 16. 15 years ago, the Judith family stood on the precipice of power. For generations, we had climbed the treacherous social ladder of the Obelian Empire, securing influence through carefully arranged marriages, strategic alliances, and whispers in the right ears. We had positioned ourselves as players in the grand game of the empire, always watching, always waiting. Finally, the fruits of our labor were within reach. Penelope Judith, my younger sister, had been engaged to the second prince, Claude de Obelia, a man who had never been destined for the throne. We, the Judiths, had never entertained the notion of placing an empress on the throne, but the wife of a prince? She would have commanded tremendous influence, prestige, and wealth. It would have been the fulfillment of everything our family had strived for. Our future was sealed. Or so we thought. Then came the unthinkable. The first prince, the rightful heir to the throne, was dead, his blood staining the very halls of the imperial palace. And the man who had slain him? Prince Claude de Obelia. The empire was thrown into turmoil. The aristocracy whispered in fear and confusion. The balance of power had been shattered, and no one knew what the new emperor would do next. But in the grand halls of House Judith, there was only celebration. Our son-in-law is now the most powerful man in the empire, my father's voice rang out, his smug satisfaction filling the room as he raised his glass in a toast. The entire family rejoiced. My brother, cousins, and even the servants were all caught up in the rapture of what we believed to be our bright new future. We were ecstatic. We had always known Penelope would become the wife of a prince. But now? She would become Empress of Obelia. Our fortunes had multiplied tenfold in a single moment. The Judith name would echo through the empire as a family of untold power. The empire would kneel before us. But even amidst the celebrations, there was one person who was not jubilant. Penelope. The news of Penelope's disappearance spread quickly through House Judith, like a cold, biting wind. The family was furious. What the hell is she thinking? My father raged, his face red with anger as he paced back and forth in the grand dining hall. She was to be empress. She was the future of our family. The emperor will come looking for her, my uncle muttered under his breath, his voice laced with a quiet concern. She can't hide forever. I will find her, I declared firmly, my voice strong as steel. I will make sure she gets back here. But Penelope didn't just disappear from the palace or our lives. She disappeared from history itself. It was as though the empire had erased her, her name was struck from every record, and soon, no one spoke of her at all. The Judith family's fury was matched only by my own growing sense of dread. We had lost the opportunity of a lifetime, and I couldn't shake the feeling that Penelope's disappearance was only the beginning of something darker. A sense of inevitability washed over me. The empire, with all its ambition, could be just as destructive as it was rewarding. By the time the Judith family learned of the emperor's rage towards Penelope, it was already too late. Penelope had already fled, leaving nothing but rumors and a shattered reputation behind her. No one knew what exactly she had done to enrage Claude. They only knew that the second prince, her former fiancé, had killed his brother, taken the throne, and erased the very existence of the first prince. Penelope, too, had been erased in her own way. She had fled, leaving her family behind, and they cursed her for it. How could she leave us? My cousin Henrietta seethed, her eyes narrowed with fury as she paced in the parlor. She was supposed to be our bridge to the throne, and now look what she's done. I couldn't bring myself to answer. It was true. Penelope had been their golden ticket, the one who would have cemented House Judith's place in the imperial court. And now, she was gone, leaving nothing but a tarnished name. The Judiths were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered dream, their anger and frustration filling the air, but none of them truly understood why Penelope had run. But it didn't matter. The Judith family had no room for understanding, no space for mercy. They cursed Penelope, they cursed her for being weak, and they cursed her for ruining everything. And as the days passed, with no word from Penelope and no sign of where she had gone, the empire's eyes turned elsewhere. The Judiths were no longer a family with a future. We were a family with a broken past, one haunted by the ghost of a girl who had once been destined for greatness. Shortly after seizing the throne, rumors began to swirl throughout the court, whispers that reached the ears of every noble and servant alike. The emperor, once distant and indifferent toward his concubines, was said to be enamored with one in particular. This concubine, who had captured his attention with her beauty and charm, quickly rose above the rest, and the palace was alive with speculation. It was said that the emperor had taken a special interest in her, seeking her out in private meetings and showering her with affection. The courtiers, ever watchful, began to notice the subtle changes in the emperor's demeanor, the way his eyes softened when she was near, the tenderness in his voice when he spoke to her. And soon, the rumors turned to something more tangible. The concubine was with child. News of her pregnancy spread like wildfire through the palace, and the implications were clear. In the eyes of the nobility, the emperor's favor toward her meant one thing: she was now the most important woman in the empire. Some whispered that she could soon be crowned empress, a position that would elevate her family to unimaginable heights. Others feared that the emperor's obsession with her would lead to the downfall of the other concubines, leaving them with nothing. Within the Judith family, the rumors were met with a mix of confusion and unease. Penelope had been their link to the throne, the Judith family's bridge to power, and now they watched as the emperor turned his affections toward another woman. For some, this was a betrayal, a painful reminder that their carefully crafted future had been dashed by circumstances beyond their control. Rosalia, ever sharp and calculating, watched the unfolding drama with a mixture of distaste and cold amusement. She knew what it meant. The emperor had chosen a new favorite, and his attentions would soon shift entirely. What did this mean for her family? For House Judith? Would Penelope's absence be forgotten, swept aside by the rising influence of another woman? And so, the Judith family waited. They waited to see if the rumors would become reality, to see whether the emperor's concubine would truly rise to power. But as the days passed and Penelope remained lost to the shadows, the family's resentment festered, their hope for a glorious future growing dimmer with each passing moment. For 9 long months, Penelope had hidden herself away, fleeing to the farthest reaches of the empire, isolated and terrified. Her family's rejection still stung, and no one, not even her once cherished House Judith, offered her aid. But despite the overwhelming odds, Penelope remained defiant, reaching out for help in a final, desperate plea. When my father received word of Penelope's situation, his response was one of cold bitterness. "She deserves what she gets," he muttered, barely glancing up from his glass. "Let her suffer for her foolishness." It was clear, the Judith family had already moved on. Penelope was no longer a part of our world, not after what she'd done. No matter that she carried a child, in the eyes of House Judith, Penelope's failure to secure the emperor's heir had rendered her and her unborn child worthless. Even news of one of the emperor's concubines bearing his child only served to deepen their disdain. It didn't matter that Penelope had carried a child as well, hers was of no consequence. She had failed to fulfill her duty, and with it, she had lost her place in the family's future. Days turned into weeks, and Penelope's condition worsened. Desperate and alone, her once lavish lifestyle had crumbled to nothing. She was no longer the proud, elegant lady of House Judith, she had become a shadow of her former self, a woman broken by her choices. And yet, in the darkest corners of her mind, Penelope clung to hope. Her child, her daughter, was the one thing she still believed in. In the quiet of the night, as Penelope's strength dwindled, she whispered to her unborn child, her voice barely a tremor in the darkness. "You will take me back to the palace," she murmured, a haunting blend of hope and sorrow in her words. "You will be my redemption. You will be great." Penelope's mind was consumed by the belief that her child, Janette, could restore the Judith name. She imagined a future in which Janette would rise to claim the power that had been stripped from her, the future Penelope had lost. It was a delusion, one born of desperation, but it kept her going in her final moments. but in the end, Penelope never saw that day. She died giving birth to Janette, alone and abandoned, just as she had feared. The Empire had stolen everything from her, and now, her own life had been taken, a casualty of a cruel world that cared little for her dreams. When word of Penelope's death reached House Judith, there was no mourning. No one cared for the life she had lost, only for the legacy she had failed to secure. "She's dead, and what do we have left?" Henrietta spat, her voice thick with contempt. "A useless girl." Her words stung like venom, and yet, they held truth. Janette was a reminder of everything House Judith had lost. A girl. Not a son. The Judiths had no use for her. A daughter born to a failed woman, someone who had thrown away her future and squandered their chances for power. "She's nothing but a burden," Lucille added, her disdain cutting through the tension in the room. A daughter. Not a son. To the Judiths, Janette was a worthless child. She was born in squalor, not in the palace, and she would never carry the weight of the Judith name. She was nothing more than a symbol of failure. But in the silence that followed, I found myself thinking differently. As cold as I had become in the face of Penelope's betrayal, I could not allow Janette to be discarded like this. I could not let this child be lost to the world simply because she had been born a girl, because she had not been born into the palace. There was a small, treacherous part of me that saw potential in her, something that, with the right manipulation, could be useful. "Perhaps," I said, my voice cutting through the room's thick silence, "she may have some value yet." My gaze shifted to Janette, who had been left forgotten in the corner of the room, a helpless child with no voice of her own. My family, unseeing and uncaring, was so focused on their loss that they failed to see the one thing I did: this child could still serve us. She could still be a tool in my hands. I didn't care for her, not like I cared for my own blood. But I would use her if it meant securing power. It was all that mattered in the end. The evening air was thick with anticipation as I arrived at Duke Alpheus's estate, the sprawling grounds silent in their majestic solitude. The Duke, a man who never indulged in unnecessary pleasantries, had a study that matched his personality, a place of dark wood, aged bookshelves, and a window that overlooked the vastness of his lands. There was no warmth to be found here, only cold, calculated precision. The kind of place where decisions were made, and lives were altered forever. As I stepped into the study, the Duke's sharp gaze met mine instantly. His fingers drummed a steady rhythm against the polished surface of his desk, a sign of his deep contemplation. Duke Alpheus was a master of silence, and I could feel the weight of his unspoken thoughts as he observed me. "Lady Judith," he greeted, his voice low and clipped. His eyes, calculating and unyielding, never wavered. "What brings you here this evening?" I took a steadying breath, trying to maintain my composure. This was no ordinary request. Janette's future, her very survival, hinged on the words I was about to speak. "I need your help, Duke Alpheus," I said, my voice steady despite the unease twisting within me. "I have a child in my care. A child with no future in this empire. I am entrusting her to you, to your family." The Duke did not respond immediately. His eyes narrowed, a flicker of curiosity flashing in them, but he said nothing, waiting for me to continue. I knew his type: practical, pragmatic, and precise. He would not act without understanding the full gravity of the situation. I hesitated for a moment, my mind racing. "Her name is Janette Judith," I finally said. The name hung in the air, heavy and fraught with meaning. "She is the daughter of my sister, Penelope." The Duke's eyes sharpened. I could see his mind working, calculating the implications of what I had just said. Penelope's name still held power in the empire, even if it was a cursed power now. The Alpheus family knew well that the Judiths were no strangers to scandal, but what I was asking of him was a far different matter. "And with that name comes a curse," I added softly. It was true, though I had no need to explain further. The Duke understood what it meant to carry such a burden. His fingers stopped tapping against the desk, and for a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing the pros and cons of the request. He did not have to help me. He had no reason to take in an orphan child from a family as fraught with scandal as the Judiths. He could simply refuse and continue with his life, unbothered. But then, to my surprise, he leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "You know I do not take children into my care without reason," Duke Alfus said slowly, his voice calculating. "And you know I have no desire to be drawn into your family's troubles." I nodded, understanding the gravity of his words. The Duke valued his independence. He was not one to take on a problem unless it was one that could bring him an advantage. "I don't want your ambition," I said quickly, my voice sharp, as if to cut through the tension. "I want your discretion. Your protection. Anonymity. Janette cannot be found. If the Emperor learns of her existence, she will be erased." Duke Alfus sat back in his chair, his expression softening just a touch. There was an understanding there now, an understanding of what was at stake. He was a man of logic and reason, but even he could see that Janette was more than just an orphan. She was a symbol of something far more dangerous to the Empire, and the Emperor's wrath would not discriminate. "I see," he murmured, his voice low and thoughtful. "And what do you expect of her once she grows?" I didn't hesitate. My words were sharp, filled with determination. "I expect her to survive," I said, my eyes meeting his steadily. "I expect her to become something more than the disaster that is her bloodline. She will not be an embarrassment. She will be a weapon, if need be." The Duke studied me for a long moment, his eyes unreadable, before he finally nodded, a small movement that signified his acceptance. His decision was not one made lightly, but I knew he recognized the value of what I was offering. The child's potential was undeniable, and the Duke understood better than anyone that there were rare opportunities in life, opportunities that were not to be squandered. "I will take her," he said, his voice resolute. "You have my word." I exhaled, the weight of the decision lifting from my shoulders, but the sense of foreboding did not leave. This was not the end of our troubles, it was merely the beginning. Janette had a future, yes, but it was one that would be shaped by forces far greater than she could ever imagine. But it was the moment when the Duke first laid eyes on Janette that everything shifted. When she was brought into his study, still a fragile infant, her sapphire jewel-like eyes staring up at him, he paused, his calculating expression giving way to something much more subtle. There was an almost imperceptible change in his gaze, a shift in the way he regarded the child. He saw something in her, something that perhaps even I had missed at first. Something rare. Something powerful. The moment was brief, but it was enough to confirm what I already knew: Duke Alfus was no fool. He saw the potential in Janette, and he understood that there was more to this child than met the eye. The Duke's gaze softened ever so slightly, and then, without saying another word, he took the child into his arms, his expression unreadable but his decision clear. He would protect Janette. And, in time, he would see what she could become. And so, the child of Penelope Judith, the girl born from scandal, betrayal, and broken promises, was taken into the Alfus family. The news reached Countess Rosalia's ears like a symphony of opportunity. The Emperor's favored concubine, once secure in her position, had now fallen out of favor. The shift in the Emperor's affections was subtle but undeniable, and Rosalia, ever the strategist, recognized it for what it was: a chance. A chance for her to maneuver, to claim the power that had been ripped from her family's grasp. With a quiet, calculating smile, she leaned back in her seat, the delicate fabric of her gown rustling around her. She allowed herself a moment of satisfaction. The delicate balance of court politics was always shifting, and this was just another turn of the wheel that might just benefit her. For Rosalia, it was a matter of timing, and she had always been excellent at waiting for the right moment to strike. Soon after Janette's birth, Princess Athanasia was born within the hallowed halls of the imperial palace, a beautiful, perfect child, wrapped in royal finery. And with her birth everything began to change. For the first time in years, the Empire turned its eyes upon a true heir, a child that would solidify the Emperor's claim to the throne. The birth of Athanasia was met with celebrations and whispers of hope. The Emperor had an heir, a daughter, a symbol of the future. But what came next was the thing that Rosalia had been waiting for, the piece of the puzzle that was music to her ears. The emperor, in his unyielding desire to ensure that his heir would be unchallenged, had ordered the death of every concubine in the Ruby Palace. The very women who had once vied for his attention and influence were now eradicated in an instant, their fate sealed by the emperor's cold hand. All those who had carried hopes of bearing him a son, all those who had thought themselves essential to his future, vanished without a trace. It was a brutal and final act, but for Rosalia, it signaled the death of her competitors. For years, she had watched as the concubines used their bloodlines to entangle themselves with powerful families, but none had succeeded in bearing a son for the emperor. And now, with their deaths, the emperor's only recognized heir was a princess. Rosalia's smile widened. This could still work. Athanasia's birth meant that Claude had no need for more concubines, no need for women to compete for his attention. The court would no longer be as crowded with potential rivals. And for Rosalia, that meant the path was clear. If she played her cards right, her family, specifically Janette, could still rise from the ashes of their downfall. For now, it seemed as if the emperor had everything in place. The birth of a princess, the downfall of his concubines, it looked as though the emperor's line was secure. But Rosalia, ever the careful observer, knew that nothing in the empire was certain. There was always room for change, always a way to bend things to her advantage. The game had shifted, but it was far from over. In the quiet recesses of her mind, Rosalia plotted her next move, thinking of Janette, of the girl who might one day claim the throne. If the emperor thought he could erase the Judith name, he was mistaken. The bloodline of House Judith was far from finished. For 3 years, Countess Rosalia remained patient. Tranquil. Watching. Waiting. The emperor's only heir was a daughter, and that alone meant there was still room for Janette to one day claim power. The nobles whispered their doubts in hushed tones. How long would Claude's interest in his daughter last? How long before his affections turned cold? At first, Rosalia wasn't concerned. No one had ever held the emperor's favor for long. His concubines had been proof of that. He had cast them aside without a second thought, some meeting cruel fates, while others simply faded into obscurity. Even Penelope, who had once been so certain of her future, had been discarded without hesitation. Rosalia believed it was only a matter of time before Athanasia suffered the same fate. But then, the murmurs began. At first, they were insignificant. Small, fleeting mentions of the emperor's supposed fondness for his young daughter. They were easy to ignore. After all, the emperor was a ruthless man. How much affection could he truly hold for a mere child? But as the years passed, as both Janette and Princess Athanasia grew, the whispers only grew louder. They spoke of the princess's intelligence, of the way her sweetness had melted the cold emperor's heart. Rosalia remained skeptical, as did the nobles. It was one thing to hear of the emperor's supposed affection, but another to witness it. And yet, no one had seen the princess outside the private residences of the imperial city. The only accounts of her charm and brilliance came from servants and tutors. Surely, it was mere exaggeration. Surely, no one, not even an imperial child, could accomplish what Penelope and the emperor's concubines had failed to do. But the rumors persisted. And the moment that solidified them, the moment that shattered all doubt, came on Princess Athanasia's grand debut. For the first time, the emperor presented his daughter to the empire, and the nobles who had once doubted his affection were forced to see the truth for themselves. The moment that sealed it was when Claude himself escorted the princess onto the ballroom floor and led her in the first dance of the night. It was undeniable. The emperor's love for his daughter was real. And Janette? Janette, who had also been introduced at court on that very same night, had been little more than an afterthought. A mere shadow, compared to the radiant, beloved princess. The emperor barely spared her a glance, his attention fixated solely on Athanasia. Rosalia did not attend the debut. She had no need to. The rumors alone told her everything she needed to know. Princess Athanasia was the empire's shining jewel, and Janette was still nothing. A girl with an uncertain future, a name with no true power. The Emperor's recognition would determine whether she could rise or fall, and as of now, Janette had yet to make her value known. Only time would tell if she, too, could earn the Emperor's favor. Like, comment and subscribe to be notified for updates in the series.